Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the 286 Project with me, Chris Akers. And on this podcast, we talk about arts, culture, politics, sport, and anything else worth talking about. Now, today's guest, as you can see behind him, he's got a new book out, Beyond Grievance, What the Left Gets Wrong About Ethnic Minorities. It's Dr. Rakib Ehsan, and he's here to join me now. Hello.
Hi, Chris. How are you?
I'm very well, extremely well. I'm really glad you're here because especially we've got a lot to talk about with your book as well. But for those who don't know you, I imagine most of my audience have seen you on like various news shows, but for those who haven't seen you, can you just explain who you are and your journey to get into this point?
Sure. I'm an academic that specialises in social cohesion, race relations, and public security. I'm a Letonian. In terms of background, I'm a Bangladeshi Muslim heritage. So essentially, in terms of the book, I'm the author of Beyond Grievance, which was published back in June. Talk about the core themes a great deal as a conversation progresses. But essentially, the one thing I wanted to do with the book is actually say, for all its flaws, that we have much to be proud of in terms of Britain being a successful or relatively successful multiracial democracy.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, to write this book, and it's a very good book, and we'll get down to details later. But obviously, your views in it and so on, even though they've been well researched and well
Mm.
critiqued, there's basically one narrative, I'd imagine, that goes through the whole race relations in the UK. And yet you've written a book which does touch on those, but then it does have a lot more nuance. And that seems to be something that seems to be lacking in the conversation, a lack of nuance when it comes to race relations. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think that in terms of British race relations, I think the main problem is that increasingly we're importing what I consider to be a quite toxic brand of racial identity politics from the United States. And I think that's hugely problematic because when compared to America, we have a very different national history and context surrounding race. And I think that more generally, when you look at our race relations conversation, I think in recent times it has been particularly divisive and polarized. So I think the one thing I really wanted to achieve with the book is bring that nuance to the table. And make no mistake, I don't look at my country through rose tinted spectacles. In the book, I talk about how there's still various forms of labour market discrimination which needs to be addressed, especially name-based discrimination. So names which are more culturally distant don't fare particularly well when set against traditionally English-sounding names, even when you control for education level, professional experience, skills, etc. I also talk about policing, which is a controversial issue in the UK. I even argue that the Met should actually be broken up in London, that it's too big to succeed. And I think that sort of model of joint governance between a Labour mayor and a Conservative Home Secretary, I don't think that's worked very well at all. And you see the various scandals, even going back to the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence, and then the undercover investigation by the Met into his family and friends. I think that casts a long shadow, if truth be told, on the Met. And more recently, you have the Casey review, which was particularly damning in terms of the cultural practices within the Metropolitan Police Service. And I also talk about other issues surrounding healthcare. I make the point in the book that compared to their white British peers, British black mothers are four times more likely to die in terms of maternal mortality. So I think there's definitely improvements to be made. But the one point that I really make in the book is that if there's one country that I trust to really make those improvements and engage with those issues compared to other European countries, it would be the UK.
So we'll get to those later because obviously those are very important
Of
points and can
course.
take me on one different path. But you said there that in terms of race relations, we tend to compare a lot to America. But
Mm,
one thing I would say that's similar in many ways with America is how we vote, in the sense
mm,
of in America, if you're an ethnic minority, you tend to vote traditionally Democrat, whereas over here it's more Labour. And yet, especially the older generation, ethnic minorities come over here, they tend to be more socially conservative, I would imagine. And yet a lot of them still vote Labour. So why do you think that is?
Well, I think that in the British context, British Muslims generally are far more socially conservative on average than the general population. Yeah, continue to overwhelmingly vote for the Labour Party. Now, if you look at America, there are differences between various ethnic and racial minorities. For example, Cuban Americans in Florida, in recent times, have really shifted towards the Republicans. So there are those differences between minority groups in the US, and you also have that in the UK as well. In recent times, upwardly mobile British Indians have increasingly given the Conservatives a hearing, and their traditional ties with the Labour Party have become somewhat frayed. But you are right that generally ethnic minority communities, despite being more culturally conservative, more likely to value their faith and having quite robust family values, they still, in quite high numbers, they struggle to give the Conservatives a chance. And I think that's largely because, for all its flaws, Labour is traditionally seen as the party that is robustly anti-discrimination when it comes to prejudice towards ethnic and racial minorities. Well, the Conservatives, if you're going back to the 60s, the legacy of Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech, and then we had the Smethwick by-election where the local Tory candidate ran an incredibly racist campaign. I think that history is hugely problematic even now. And I think that when it comes to the Labour Party, it was the Labour Party that passed those race relations acts in the 1960s to help facilitate the social, political and economic integration of ethnic minorities. So while some ethnic minority groups have shifted away from Labour and given the Conservatives more of a hearing, it's perhaps not in the numbers that you expect when you consider how socially conservative many voters in those groups are.
Is it because you're almost seen as traitorous as every minority in this country if you vote Conservative? And I'll give you a great example of that. I went to a spoken word night a few months ago, and there was a poet there, and he talked about, his poem was about immigration. And he was just as Rishi Sunak came into power and Sir Barthelme were announcing their immigration policy.
Sure.
He said before he recited the poem, he said, considering they're people of colour, they should know better. And he was like almost his thing of, oh, wow, these people of colour, so therefore they should be holding for immigration, but if you go in, we'll just let them all in. Isn't that one of the problems, that you're almost seen as traitorous if you go against a certain narrative?
I think that thinking is incredibly toxic. I think that ethnic minority voters, they're perfectly entitled to have conservative views on immigration, multiculturalism and law and order. And I've always said that the Conservative government, there's plenty of material to criticise them on in terms of policy delivery and the general performance of when it comes to governing the country. But I think you're almost arguing that it's more acceptable for white British people to have conservative views when it comes to those public policy areas. And I think that's actually incredibly divisive for British democracy on the whole. I think there's plenty of things to criticise. For example, the UK-Rwanda migration partnership, it hasn't really worked at all in terms of the objective of reducing the number of people crossing the English Channel via small boats. So I think I've always argued that it's very important to criticise politicians based on their policies and ideas. I think that if you start targeting them on the grounds of their racial and ethnic identity, or religious identity as well, or rather arguing that because of their background, they should subscribe to a certain set of views in certain policy areas, I don't think that's right at all. And I actually think that weakens the quality of political debate in our country.
I agree with your last point, but in a world where identity politics is king, that's been for the last decade, how easy is it to change a narrative around that?
Difficult. It's incredibly difficult because that thinking has become increasingly embedded in certain circles. I think that there's certain elements of the contemporary British left they're completely obsessed with identity politics, and when it comes to criticizing Tory politicians, all too often they bring their racial identity, ethnic heritage, or their religious background into the debate. But if truth be told, it's not just sort of hard left activists we're talking about here. We're also talking about mainstream liberal left commentators in the British media who are also guilty of that. So it will be very difficult, but I'd really like to think that over time that we can move away from that toxic line of thinking and really focus on the bread and butter of judging politicians based on the quality of their proposals and policy delivery once they're in government.
It comes across as very patronising to the point where I hear, like Greg's, as you know, I'm like a big boxing fan, and you had Natasha Jonas who got her manager's license. And the first article I read about it, oh, she's the first Black British woman to get a manager's license. And I'm thinking, to me, I can understand it in terms of a landmark a little bit, but to me, that doesn't matter. It's like, as long as you're good at your job. And I think that's part of the problem now. It's almost you're using someone's identity in terms of testing their suitability for various areas of life where it should be their competence that should be looked at.
No, absolutely, and don't get me wrong. That is a historic moment in the sport, and I think that can be celebrated. But ultimately, we have to judge characters based on how they perform in their role. And I think, to be fair, I think Britain is fairly well positioned when you're looking at the public at large. I think that we have a Prime Minister of Punjabi Hindu origin in the shape of Rishi Sunak. I think the vast majority of the British public, polling shows, they either feel that having our first non-white prime minister is either something to be celebrated, or it's just something that people are just at ease with. They don't necessarily have a positive or negative view towards it, because ultimately they're more focused on quality of governance. How does the government reach its goals? Essentially, has it been successful in fulfilling their responsibilities when it comes to protecting their own citizens? Those are the kind of things that they focus on. So I think that overall, in that sense, Twitter, well, now known as X, is not necessarily reflective of the wider British public.
One thing that's talked about a lot as well is this whole white privilege, which I wouldn't say that isn't white privilege, but do you think it gets lost in, how can I put this? Do you think it's too encompassing? In other words, what I was going back to earlier with this nuance, yes, okay, there might be privilege in that sense, but it doesn't necessarily tell the whole story.
No, absolutely. I think that in terms of British social policy, I don't think US-inspired white privilege theories are of much use. Some of the most deprived parts of the country are predominantly white. We also have predominantly ethnic minority populations locally in the country, which also are very deprived. But one of the biggest arguments that I make in the book, Beyond Grievance, is one of the greatest advantages that you can have in life is belonging to a stable family unit and having loving, attentive parents. And the reality is, I think that when it comes to those advantages, there's certain ethnic minority communities which are actually better off compared to the white British mainstream. And if you do look at left behind, relatively deprived communities which are predominantly white British, you see that the rates of family breakdown and the types of family formation are quite weak. While if you look at East London, there's relatively deprived parts of East London, but when you look at the British-Bangladeshi families there, they're more conventionally stable. And there is that dynamic where their faith may well be a source of optimism and resilience in terms of coping with the challenges of everyday life. Well, we've seen the sort of rapid secularization of the white British mainstream. So I think that when you look at all these dynamics, it really shows that those theories of white privilege, they're incredibly narrow, and they don't necessarily help you analyze the broader picture when looking at the social and economic disparities in modern Britain.
You've kind of explained a little bit there, but what is it specifically about the family that makes outcomes a lot greater for people who belong to strong families and who develop strong families later on in life?
No, absolutely. So, for example, lone parent households, children living in lone parent households are far more likely to live in poverty and deprivation. And that will have a disproportionate impact within specific ethnic minority communities. So I'll give you an example. If you're looking at children aged up to 15 years, in our society, when you look at those children of Indian origin, 6% are living in lone parent households. That goes up to 19% for their white British peers, and all the way up to 63% for their peers of Black Caribbean origin. And there's a wealth of evidence now which shows that family structure is significantly associated with a variety of youth outcomes, whether that's mental health, physical well-being, level of school attainment, cognitive development, and then further down the line, labour market integration, how well individuals do in terms of employment. So I think that if you're talking about social policy, I don't think race is necessarily an influential determinant when it comes to shaping life chances. But I do think family background and also the sort of the level of trust in a local community, I think those kind of factors count for a lot more.
One thing you just mentioned there, which is close to my heart, is mental health.
Mm,
And I've heard somewhere, I think it was last week, that Black people, I think, are 10 times more likely to be committed
mm,
without mental illness than, say, most of the, I think it's white population. Are those stats accurate? And also, what other stats with regards to how ethnic minorities and mental health in terms of A, the rates of developing it, and B, in terms
mm.
of the likelihood of them being committed?
But absolutely. So in terms of mental health, compared to the general population, British Black people are notably more likely to be sectioned under the Mental Health Act. But the overall picture when it comes to mental health is quite mixed. So if you're looking at suicide attempts or suicide ideation and carrying out acts of self-harm, more generally, white people fare worse than Black and Asian people when it comes to those mental health indicators. So the picture is quite mixed in the sphere of mental health. But one of the real factors, which is quite interesting and doesn't get talked about very much, is the role of faith and religion. Now, traditionally, people who have a stronger religious identity, or they have some form of religious identification, they may identify as Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Sikh, Buddhist. They're notably more likely to say they're happy in life, that they're a happy person, that they're satisfied with life, and they're more optimistic about their future when compared to those who say that their religious background is not very important to their personal identity. They may have no stated religious affiliation, or they may flat out reject the existence of gods or higher spiritual powers. And I think that just doesn't get talked about enough because we've undergone this process of rapid secularization. When it comes to talking about mental health, faith at the moment doesn't really get a looking. But I would like to think that over time that will change, and I'd like to play a personal part in that.
So, and I agree with you, faith, we can give someone a sense of
Mm,
stillness and belonging.
sure.
But do you think, even within like racial groups, do you think that picture will change? Because we seem to be more secular along in terms of the younger generation, regardless of what race you are part of. Whereas the older
Mm.
generation, I think there might be different levels, but there may be overall more religious. So do you think there might be a change because we're just becoming more secular as years go on?
I think the changes will be different from group to group. And what I mean by that is that certain groups, their level of integration in the white British secular mainstream may be stronger compared to other groups. For example, if you look at the wider British Black population, Black Caribbeans who are, they're more established in terms of duration. We could talk about the Windrush generation. They've been more of a notable presence in the UK for a longer time than, say, the average British Black African. Many British Black Africans were not born in the UK, and compared to the average British Black Caribbean, they're more recently arrived. They're actually more likely to be a first generation migrant. And they're also more likely to have a stronger attachment to their faith. Now, as you say, over time, generation to generation, there may be a secularization process. But if you look at people of Pakistani and Bangladeshi origin, two ethnic groups which are majority Sunni, there's very high levels of in-group choice when it comes to marriage. So what you'll have there is that the average person in those ethnic groups are not only more likely to marry someone belonging to the same faith, they're also still very likely to marry within their own ethnic group as well. And that could even go down to their region of origin back in Bangladesh or Pakistan. So I think it really depends on when you're talking about that secularization process, or rather people detaching themselves from religion over time. I think much of that depends on the degree to which they bond and remain in group, especially when it comes to marriage, and the degree to which they socially and culturally integrate in the rapidly secularized white British mainstream.
With the figures that you mentioned in the book with regards to mental health, I'm just wondering, with ethnic minorities, could it be argued there's more of a taboo when it comes to mental health? And as such, could those figures that you just put in a book, could they actually be a lot higher, but it's just not being reported because there's more of a taboo?
I think there's definitely truth in that. If you're saying that there is a stigmatization or a stronger forms of stigmatization within certain minority groups when it comes to mental health, talking about it, expressing personal vulnerabilities, then I definitely think there's an element of truth in that. But these surveys are confidential. They're not face to face. Quite often they have an online methodology. So I think it allows the individual who are doing those surveys a bit more freedom to reveal their true feelings about their own mental health. This isn't like they're talking about this with a family member or just even talking to someone face to face. They're doing an online survey. So I think that means that the figures there, that they are more likely to be accurate. And I think generally when you look at studies in other countries, there is that pattern that stronger religious identification is traditionally associated with more positive mental health outcomes.
The other thing that's been in the news, especially over the last few years regarding
Mm,
race, is BLM.
mm.
Now, obviously, that originated in America with what happened with George Floyd. BLM has been transported not just over here, but over Western countries. And yet, as we talked about before, in terms of differences between British and American race relations, that's something that's imported. How can I put this? Why was why is it imported? Because it seems to me it seems to be radically different. For example, obviously our police don't carry guns, so
Mm.
was it imported? And do you think that people have actually taken advantage of it to perpetuate a narrative that isn't, well, I wouldn't say not just false, but also just almost lying in respect?
I have a lot of sympathy with that view, in terms of people are ultimately perpetuating falsehoods, which nestle in with their particular political or social agenda. I think that what it really shows there's an intellectual deficit, and I don't think this is only on the British left. I think there's also an intellectual deficit on the conservative right as well, in the UK, where there's two big elements on the right who are, for example, very obsessed with Donald Trump, who I consider to be an incredibly divisive figure. But I think when you're talking about anti-racism in the UK, perhaps it's just it's a byproduct of living in an increasingly interconnected world, that ideological activists in the UK, they will communicate more with their counterparts in the US. They may exchange ideas, but it seems like to me that the leftist British activists, they're drawing a great deal of inspiration from the experiences and the views and the ideological beliefs of their counterparts in the United States. And I think when you talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, that was always my concern, that there'd be this importation of US racial identity politics, to the point where you had British protesters chanting at their own police officers, "Don't shoot," even though they're largely unarmed and they support that model of policing as well. Um, I'll give you an example, Chris. The Battle of Bamber Bridge during World War II, where you had American soldiers, including African American soldiers, in this Lancastrian village of Bamber Bridge, and the American commanders tried to enforce American South style segregation in this Lancastrian village. And the pub landlords there in that part of Lancashire said, "Sorry, we don't do that here in the UK. You know, you might do that in the United States, but this is not going to be taking place on our doorstep. And I think in a way that demonstrates how advanced we were on matters of race compared to the United States, which I think is a country, it continues to struggle with the legacy of slavery, but also very recent forms of segregation as well. So I've always said that if we have an anti-racist politics in the UK, which is mature and sensible, it has to focus on the bread and butter of what's actually going on in the UK and focus less on what's going on in the United States.
It's interesting you brought up that story from the Second World War, because it leads me on to another question, which isn't, and we'll talk more about solutions later, but just this one solution, isn't a solution to this actually look at how not just Black people, but ethnic minorities have contributed to British society? Would that create more of a cohesiveness? And when I say contribute, I'm not just talking in terms of the stereotypical like sport and entertainment, but in terms of, say, inventors, war and that, and so on and so forth. Wouldn't that be one way to create this cohesiveness, that actually they actually contributed more than actually we realise? And when I say that, I'm not talking about BBC Horrible Histories, which kind of rewrit the whole thing, just absolutely crazy. But actually, people like Charles, I know he was American, but Charles S. Drew, for instance, and Aldridge, who like taught Shakespeare, these sorts of people who really, Black people who really contributed to British society, wouldn't that be one way of creating more?
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I think someone that springs to mind having this discussion is Baron Constantine. You know, the what a fantastic man he was. He did so much for the anti-racism movement in the UK, and I do believe he was the first British Black peer as well. A fantastic cricketer, by the way, but he was a lot more than that. He really stood up and said, you know what, we really want to improve racial equality in the UK, and he really led from the front. And he also fought for greater workers' protections for members of the Windrush generation who had recently arrived in the UK. For me, I think he should be studied about in every single school in the UK. I think it's such a legendary character who contributes so much to British life. And as you say, I think when people talk about British Black contribution, they tend to focus on entertainment and sport, which I think is actually quite poor, because there's many examples of British Black excellence across a variety of industries. I would like to see more when it comes to entrepreneurship, which is why, listen, I'd actually say when it comes to economics, I'll probably lean a bit to the left. I do think that the inequalities of market capitalism, that can actually have a testing effect on social cohesion if you have that kind of rampant economic inequality. But we have many successful Black British-owned businesses, entrepreneurs. In my view, they're just not given the attention that they deserve, in my opinion. And I think that could go into other fields in terms of healthcare, the sciences. So I'm not the sort of horrible history sketches, which some of them do actually, they indulge in historical revisionism. We don't need to go down that road. I think what we should focus on and what we should celebrate are many cases of ethnic minority excellence in the post-World War II era, across a variety of ethnic and religious minority communities who have made the UK their home. And I think if that was integrated in our schools, and also in our universities, where I think that there has unfortunately been a cultural change there, which has really indulged in the politics of victimhood, I think that could be really beneficial when it comes to boosting social cohesion in our diverse society.
I agree with everything you said. What I would add, though, do you think it has to come within the group as well? And this is one of the points I make about history, is that I would like to see more Black British history, about Asian history in schools. But I think the one country, in terms of learning about history, massive factor which very few people talk about is actually within the families, like how much families teach each other. And maybe it's just me, but I don't think, certainly I think from Black people don't tell each other our own history. Like we'll talk about Windrush, and we'll talk about that a lot. And obviously that now, the last few years, you've talked about like the slave trade in Britain. But outside of that, I don't know if within families we talk about other history, like Black British history, or especially now there seems to be a lot of books over the last decade that have been written about Black British history. I'm just wondering how many people have actually taken the effort to do that themselves, or maybe that's just me being pessimistic.
Well, I mean, I think for me, ultimately, I focus on the data. I wouldn't really want to say what's going on, in ethnic minority families and households. But I think the one thing that I will say is that when we have mainstream commentary on the Black British population more generally, it seems to be very doom and gloom, incredibly negative as well. When I think there are many positive stories to be told, and I think in terms of the history as well, um, I think that there may even be a fundamental lack of understanding among quite young UK-born British Black Caribbeans when it comes to understanding the sort of entrepreneurial spirit, the dynamism and optimism that characterized the Windrush generation. And I think that's a very important part. That's a very important part of community history, if you can call it that. So I think, unfortunately for me, I think that when it comes to younger generations, there's problematic subcultures. Much of it is American inspired. I think that when we're looking in certain parts of London, there are unfortunately subcultures. It's almost a glorification of hyper materialism. I think even at times, even violence, if I'm being truthfully honest. And I think that's so far detached from um, the Windrush generation, largely very devoted to their Christian faith. They almost felt like coming to the UK was almost coming to the motherland of the empire, in a sense, and they really wanted to play their part in improving Britain. So I do think there's almost an intergenerational disconnect there, which needs to be addressed.
So, how much of that generational gap was damaged by the Windrush scandal a few years ago? And based on the events that's happened over last week, because we talked about BLM and their support for what
Mm.
happened in the Middle East, how would that affect race relations? I know they're probably two separate questions. Obviously, just take it.
Yeah, I think for me, I've always said that the Windrush scandal was a national scandal. It should be told, and I think that that's where you can't necessarily blame British Black Caribbean communities for having relatively low levels of institutional trust when you see the scandals associated with the Met and the Windrush scandal. So I think there's significant forms of repair that needs to be done in terms of the damage that's been caused to those state-citizen relations. But I think that while people may feel that was a fundamental injustice, and it was, there's still that their understanding of the Windrush generation, the circumstances under which that they moved to the UK, and the contributions that they made on arrival. If you actually ask certain individuals, maybe younger members of the Black British communities, I'm not entirely sure how knowledgeable they are when it comes to that. When it comes to that story, so I think that what you talk about there, of course, education in the schools is important, but also education within communities
Yeah.
is also important. And I think that's where, when I look at Notting Hill Carnival, for example, the origins of it was actually quite educational. And there's a real sense of, almost an educational purpose, really celebrating cultural heritage. And I'm sorry to say, I think that has been somewhat lost, especially when you've seen the more recent editions. And unfortunately, that's made for very negative press coverage, which in itself is not necessarily ideal for race relations in the UK. But I think more generally, when you're looking at things which are going on in other parts of the world, I've always said you have to keep the focus on the UK. Very concerned by the importation of racial identity politics from the US. I'm also concerned about the importation of subcontinental style sectarianism, which very much reared its ugly head when it came to last year's disorders in Leicester. And I think that when you're looking at foreign territorial grievances, geopolitical conflict in the Middle East, you really don't want that to be having a negative impact on community relations in the UK. But unfortunately, the evidence suggests that it is having that impact. And I think that all too often politicians, that not only they're uneasy when it comes to approaching those issues, I think in some ways they even fan the flames by being quite tribal themselves.
How much do we underestimate inter relations between groups within a group? So, for example, Black Caribbeans and Black
Mm,
Africans and stuff that's happened there. Obviously, my hometown of Birmingham, what happened a few years
mm.
ago with that story that led to a riot and whatnot, a false story led over to riot in terms of just talking over the radio. How much do we underestimate? And you mentioned it in Leicester,
Mm.
the actual the differences between within groups.
Oh no, absolutely. I think that I think that many people underestimate the degree of social tensions between ethnic minorities and within racial groups. I've done research which shows that when you look at British Black Caribbeans, 1 in 6 have a generally unfavourable view of British Black Africans,
Mhm.
and when it goes in the opposite direction, I think it's 6%, which is also not necessarily an insignificant number. I think that when you look at certain racial communities, I still think colorism is a discriminatory force in certain communities. People having a preference when it comes to their children getting married, they have a preference for their child spouse to be a fairer skin color. That dynamic actually exists in the UK, and I think, but ethnic minorities know this themselves. When you look at a report that Hope Not Hate published during the COVID-19 pandemic, it found that the ethnic minority respondents in their polling were twice as likely to think that the tensions between ethnic minority groups were stronger than the tensions between the white mainstream and non-white communities, which shows you that there is an understanding there, even among ethnic and racial minorities, that the tensions between them and within their own communities is actually quite strong. And dare I say that some of the sharpest social tensions in the UK do not involve white British people at all.
Yeah, indeed. Earlier this year, I've seen the US. I think it's a group of Asian American students
Mm.
from Harvard, the Supreme Court, because of, and long story short, affirmative action is now being outlawed in the States. What are your views on affirmative action? And yeah, just basically what your views on affirmative action, first of all.
I don't think it has any place in the UK. And once again, I'll make this point that America has a very different history and context. But what was interesting is that some of the strongest forms of opposition to affirmative action are coming from Asian Americans who might find their origins in countries such as China.
Mhm.
So I think what that shows there is obviously the redundancy of acronyms such as BAME. And I also think that when you're looking at positive discrimination, for me is a hugely embarrassing oxymoron. I don't think discrimination can ever be positive. Now, that's not to say that institutions, if they want to broaden their pool of recruits, they can engage with particular ethnic and religious communities, in terms of publicizing and promoting that the work they do, encouraging people to join that organization. But I'm very uncomfortable with the idea of racial quotas. For example, because I think the problem you'd have there is that you could have very talented and capable ethnic minority people in high positions who may well be presiding over others who may believe that they're just there as a token choice. And I don't think that's right at all. I think that that'd be very damaging for social cohesion. So I think more generally, when it comes to affirmative action, I don't think that it's only that I oppose it. I think that the majority of ethnic minority people in the UK, what they expect is fairness, not favours.
So there's sometimes still a discrepancy with NATO's insane occupations. So
Hmm.
what, and I know you outline this in the book, what are the certain solutions that we could have in regards to, because you may not get it to like level, but you could certainly possibly reduce it. So what sort of solutions would you have to like um, help that reduce that discrepancy?
Yeah, I think that in terms of the labour market, I really think name blind application should be more of a thing. And I think it's quite commonplace in other countries. Now, of course, that's not going to change the fact that you are still going to be the same skin color when it comes to the interview stage. But the idea there is that you would have a fairer process towards the interview stage, you would have more people, culturally distant names, at least reaching the interview stage, where they will have the opportunity to provide a positive and impressive account of themselves in person. So I think that, I would like to see an expansion of name blind application processes in the public, private, and third sectors. But then there are also factors, Chris, which lead to relatively high levels of female economic inactivity in certain communities. That might be ultra-conservative gender norms in particular communities. I'm thinking particularly, conservative-minded Muslim communities. There may well be those gender norms which lead to higher rates of female economic inactivity. So that's not necessarily discrimination in the labour market. That's just more to do with internal cultural attitudes within communities. So the reality is, when you're looking at those disparities, they're not necessarily automatic byproducts of discrimination. There may well be a variety of factors in play. And I think that if I could just kindly make this point, I think one of the biggest problems we have in the UK is that we're very regionally unequal. So I would say that, if I'm being completely honest, that your average ethnic minority individual in London, more times than not, will have greater opportunities than the average ethnic minority individuals in a left behind post-industrial town in Northern England, because of that regional inequality. So I think that, we heard this term many times, levelling up. Unfortunately, I haven't really seen much evidence of that during this parliamentary term under the Conservatives. But I think that if we have a social policy that focuses more on how do you support families and how do you support communities at risk of family breakdown, and more generally, how we can spread opportunity and how can we bolster investment in regions which have been starved of it for decades, I think those are the kind of things that we should be working towards.
Your book's subtitled "What the Left Get Wrong About Ethnic Minorities." What does the right get wrong about ethnic minorities?
Chris, they get plenty wrong. That's the truth of it. They get plenty wrong because many of those ethnic minorities are culturally conservative, and the Conservatives can't make any real headway. And that's even when they have ethnic minority politicians in very high-ranking positions, including Prime Minister. I think what they get wrong, in my view, and I'm sure you've seen this on social media, that this idea that London has fallen. The Conservatives can't win in London. It's too diverse for us to win in London.
Yeah.
I think that kind of attitude, I think exactly the kind of attitude which meant that Sean Bailey's, his quest to become London mayor, it was doomed to fail. Not because of him, but because his party didn't really believe in him, and they didn't believe in his chances of winning in London. And I think that if you actually look at the recent results, which have been quite promising for the Conservative Party locally, it's been in places like Harrow, Leicester, which is a majority non-white city, Slough as well. And I know that that's largely because the local Labour Party there's been gross financial mismanagement in Slough. But the Tories did well there in the last local election. So I think that what the Conservatives need to do is, how do we engage better with ethnic minority communities who are actually they're traditionally conservative. But I think that along with being traditionally conservative, they still may well have concerns when it comes to matters of racial fairness. They still may have concerns in terms of the discrimination that their communities may face, especially when it comes in the labour market, housing. They may be concerned about certain disparities surrounding healthcare. So they need to engage with that. So a combination of being socially traditional, which at times I think the Conservative Party struggles. I have to question how traditionally conservative any party is if they can make Boris Johnson their leader, if I'm being completely honest. But I think they need to blend that with a strong sense of social justice. So kind of social justice traditionalism, that could help the Conservatives make headway with many ethnic and religious minority communities. But at the moment, they're not even close to being there.
One thing in terms of making headway, and we kind of talk about this in terms of voting and whatnot, that kind of proves that not all ethnic minorities think the same, is Brexit. I know you've talked about before, obviously, your hometown of Luton, like in terms of how many ethnic minorities voted for Brexit. Can you just talk about that and go into reasons as to why ethnic minorities would have voted for Brexit?
Sure. Well, my hometown voted Leave. Luton's 56.5%. Slough, a majority non-white population, also voted to leave. So did Bradford. Leicester voted to remain, but there was a very high leave percentage there, but far higher than expected. And I think in terms of the factors underpinning those voting patterns, the reality is that when you look at first generation migrants that came from the Indian subcontinent, but also East Africa and maybe of Asian origin, they were encouraged to integrate into British society. It wasn't a European society. The emphasis was on British integration. And I also think that when you're looking at some of those first generation migrants, they may have had close links with the British Indian Army, for example, in the Second World War, or the Merchant Navy. So their attachments were very much to Britain. It wasn't to Europe as a continent. Mm-hmm. And many may well have felt when you look at EU freedom of movement, when we were an EU member state, essentially one could argue that it's predominantly white European migrants who are the beneficiaries of preferential treatment under freedom of movement. And I think that within more established ethnic minority communities, there may have been that feeling, well, that's not particularly fair. So why is it that maybe an unskilled labourer who has a fairly poor command of English from Bratislava is allowed fairly smooth access into the UK, while maybe my nephew, who's a qualified engineer in Bangalore, speaks very good English? Why does he have to fill all this paperwork? Why does he have to go through all these assessments before he is allowed to relocate to the UK? So there may have been that sense we almost had a two-tier immigration system as a result of that. So there's the identity issue, there's the immigration issue. But also more generally, it may have just been a strategic matter of foreign policy as well. Perhaps they felt that the EU is a sclerotic and inefficient bloc, and that the UK, when it comes to foreign policy, they should focus more and more emerging, youthful and dynamic markets in Asia, Africa and the Caribbean.
Yeah, you kind of touched on this, almost coming towards the end, but you kind of touched on this when you talked about solutions in terms of a labour market. But in terms of race relations in the UK, are there, say, 5 main points, or possibly even more, that you can think of that you think actually this is how we can improve race relations in this country?
Oh, you put me on the spot, mate. You really have. I think one thing you really mentioned well was education and history in particular. I think that when it comes to knowledge of the contribution made by Asian, African and Caribbean service people to the Allied victory in terms of defeating Nazism and fascism in World War II, I think wider public awareness of that is still relatively low, in my opinion. And I think that's a real shame, because that really should be known about by a lot more people. And I think in a way that would help UK-born school children who may be of Asian, African and Caribbean origin. They may feel that they can buy in more when it comes to that, it's like that traditional British story of success when it came to defeating Nazism and fascism. So I think firstly, having a more inclusive approach to teaching history in the UK. And a lot of people on the left might be uncomfortable with that, because I think that's a glorification of militarism. But the reality is wars need to be won. That's the truth of it. And you saw the threat of Nazism and fascism there. If that side won, then there'd be many Asian, African and Caribbean people who'd be in deep trouble, if truth be told. So I think firstly education. I think that in terms of the labour market, we talked about those name blind applications. I think that we need to keep the focus on meritocracy, and I still think that we're some way away from that. You want to have a more merit-based allocation of rewards and opportunities. So I think we really need to work on how do we ensure that through anti-discrimination rules in the labour market. I also think in terms of race relations, we need to have a new dawn when it comes to policing. I think that policing in recent times has suffered considerable controversies surrounding race. And that really needs to be addressed. And I think that really needs to be addressed in London, where I think the Met is very much on borrowed time. And I think if it doesn't sort itself out soon, in terms of, having a mass clear out of wholly undesirable individuals within the Met, and also how it interacts with inner city communities. For example, with stop and search. Stop and search is controversial, but the Met believes that it's a genuinely important instrument for it to use in order to combat knife crime. Then they need to have buy-in from the local communities that they serve, including communities who may have younger individuals who will disproportionately face that particular policing practice or stop and search. So you have the education, the labour market, policing. I think in terms of healthcare, you'll know, Chris, that we have a growing layer of diversity, equality, and inclusion professionals in the NHS. I'm not sure of how much use they actually are. So what I want to see is, in a way, you have civic associations in many towns and cities. They really work hard to connect marginalised minorities to NHS trusts, to hospitals, to ensure that they get the care that they need. And it might be language barriers at play, a lack of institutional trust. I don't think these DEI professionals are focusing on that at all. So I think what we need to do is, when we look at healthcare outcomes, how do we reduce those barriers to accessing healthcare treatment that people desperately need? And there may be barriers to access, as I say, a lack of trust in the healthcare system. It might even be down to language barriers. If so, we need to address that, because I think that's actually a very positive form of integration if people actually have confidence in their own healthcare system. Because if they don't, that can be incredibly problematic, even when it comes to their own life expectancy and their just general well-being. So I think I have 4 there now. I think that more generally, if you're looking at race relations and community cohesion, I'm going to have to finish on sport, and we both love sport at the end of the day. And I'm gonna, if you could be so kind, I'm gonna talk about Luton Town a little bit.
Yeah, cool.
For me, when I was growing up, there was a great deal of tension between Islamist extremists and the far right. We had the Butchers of Basra demonstrations, then the subsequent formation of the English Defence League. But never underestimate the power of a football club to bring different communities together that usually wouldn't socially interact with one another. Because what you had through clubs such as Luton Town, you have sort of young white working class lads and their peers of South Asian Muslim origin. If there's one thing that can bring those two groups together, it's football. I'm more generally sport, but particularly football. And I think that it just shows football clubs are just not private sector institutions. They're vital community assets. And actually, they could actually be considered to be anchor institutions, which can be utilised in order to bolster social cohesion in more diverse parts of the country. So the one thing I'd like to see is that government, in terms of trying to do everything itself, actually gives the power and resources and also promotes those community assets, including football clubs, when it comes to strengthening social solidarity in local communities, which may be relatively diverse. So those have been my 5. Those have been my 5 points.
Cool. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. We're both going to the Battle of Ideas. This will come out after the Battle of Ideas, or take place in London. Is there anywhere else you're going to be talking about your book? And also, where can people purchase your book?
So the book can be Beyond Grievance, What the Left Gets Wrong About Ethnic Minorities. It can be purchased on Amazon Prime, so next day delivery. So it should be next day delivery. I will be at Battle of Ideas, which I'm really looking forward to seeing you in person, Chris. I'll be there talking on the Saturday and Sunday. But other than that, I'll be very busy working on a number of projects. But if people want to follow my work, they can give me a follow on Twitter at Rakib Ehsan, RAKIB EHSAN.
Oh, cool. As I say, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. All the very best with the book, and all the very best for the future. All right, take care.
Thank you for having me.